Tonight we're taking a long, dark stroll through human history's cruelest corners, the places where pain wasn't an accident but an art form. Picture this. You're shackled in a mouldy stone cell beneath the Tower of London, and you hear scratching. Not from the guards. Not even from other prisoners. It's from the rats. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. They've learned that where there's screaming, there's dinner. This isn't just a spooky bedtime story. It's a grim record scratched into the stone walls of real places where real people endured unthinkable torment. You probably won't survive this, emotionally, that is. But I promise to keep things just scary enough to make you question every creak in your walls tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it? Post it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly into the underbelly of the Tower of London, lantern in hand. The air is thick with centuries of rot, and the walls sweat with dampness. Some say this is where Anne Boleyn whispered her final prayers. Others claim it's where the rats held court, and where torture took on a deeply rodent-flavored twist. The Rat Dungeon, as it's grimly known, wasn't just an ominous nickname. Below the White Tower lies a series of caverns once partially submerged by the nearby Thames. When the tide rose, water flooded in, sometimes chest-deep, sometimes just enough to soak your skin and steal your warmth. Guards would toss prisoners down here, shackled and naked, left to sit in freezing water. But the real horror didn't come from the cold. It came from the skittering feet in the darkness. Rats. Starved, wild, and numerous. They chewed. They climbed. They gnawed on living flesh. And they came by the hundreds. Imagine the gnawing starting at your toes and working upward. You try to swat them off, but your hands are bound, and your screams only make them more curious. Historians still argue whether the rats were trained into sadistic tools or just opportunistic squatters. There's little hard evidence of a formal torture method that involved tossing rats into prisoner cells intentionally, but oral accounts and writings from the 15th and 16th centuries describe something eerily similar. One fringe theory even suggests guards might have rubbed prisoners in animal fat or fish oil to encourage nibbling. Like a macabre charcuterie board. Then there's the famed tale of the rat box torture, which may have been used later in other parts of Europe but has roots here in London's law. Picture this. A metal cage filled with angry rats is strapped to your bare stomach. The torturer heats the opposite side of the box. The rats, panicking, burrow in the only direction available, into you. Cozy, right? That version became infamous in later centuries, but whispers say its prototype lived in the tower's lower chambers. Now, not every victim of the tower met their end with rodents. Many were simply left to rot in miserable solitude, awaiting execution or dying of exposure. But the dungeon became a symbol of psychological torture, a place where imagination often hurt more than physical wounds. Just knowing you were beneath the surface, with nothing but rats and rising tides for company, could break a mind long before the body followed. Let's be honest, medieval London wasn't exactly five-star living up above either. Chamber pots emptied into the streets, and hygiene was more of a theory than a practice. But down here, hygiene checked out centuries ago. The floor was a mix of mud, blood, and waste. The chains were never cleaned. The walls whispered back. You weren't just a prisoner, you were an ingredient in a stew of misery. One mainstream historical fact: the Tower of London was not originally designed as a torture chamber. William the Conqueror built it in 1078 as a royal residence and fortress. But by the 13th century, it had become the go-to storage unit for enemies of the crown, and over time, that storage unit got some very unfriendly upgrades. Torture tools like the rack, manacles, and pressing boards made appearances, and their echoes are still felt in the bone-chilling guided tours today. And yet, Oddly enough, England was late to the torture game compared to other parts of Europe. By law, torture was technically illegal under common law, except when authorized by royal warrant. So when it did happen, it carried an extra sting. It was personal. You weren't just being tortured. You were being chosen for it. There's a quirky little detail many overlook. One of the tower's most feared rooms, the infamous Little Ease, was barely 4 feet square. You couldn't sit, lie down, or even stand fully upright. You just existed. Cramped. Dark. Alone. And for some, that tiny space, with rats creeping nearby and screams echoing above, was worse than any blade or fire. You might think the past is a different country, that we've evolved. But here's the unsettling truth. While the setting changes, the methods of fear remain strangely familiar. Isolation. Darkness. Sensory overload. Sleep deprivation. The tower just gave these things an address. Imagine yourself now, hunched in the corner of a cell. Your breath fogs in front of your face. You hear the scratching again, louder this time. A soft splash. Then another. You'd call for help, but your throat is raw from screaming. You close your eyes, hoping it's all a nightmare. But this is no dream. This is history. And it's only the beginning. You blink, disoriented, as the tower walls fade. Stone becomes sun-bleached and hot. You're not in England anymore. You're in ancient Sicily, where cruelty smolders just as much as the air around you. Someone's dragging you forward, and before you looms the twisted pride of tyrants, the Brazen Bull. It stands in the center of a courtyard, gleaming bronze and shaped with uncanny precision. Life-sized, muscular, even majestic, if you squint past the horror. It's hollow inside, but there's a small hatch in the side, just large enough to shove a person through. Guess who? The Brazen Bull was allegedly the brainchild of Perillos of Athens, a craftsman with a flair for the theatrical. He brought the idea to Phalaris, the infamous tyrant of Akragas in the 6th century BCE. His pitch? A form of execution that wasn't just fatal, it was performative. The victim would be locked inside the bull, and a fire lit beneath the belly. As the metal heated, the person inside roasted alive. But Perillos went a step further. He designed the bull's head with a series of acoustic tubes, like a grotesque musical instrument. The screams of the victim, funneled and distorted, would emerge from the bull's nostrils as trumpet-like roars, mimicking the sound of a raging bull. Torture meets sound design. And in a twist worthy of ancient irony, Phalaris supposedly tested the invention by throwing Perillos himself inside. Great idea, buddy, let's see how it works. Historians still argue whether the Brazen Bull actually existed or was more symbolic, a moral tale wrapped in metal. Some say it was propaganda, invented by enemies to smear Phalaris. Others point to scattered Roman texts that reference similar devices used in other regions, suggesting the concept may have had disturbing legs. One widely accepted fact, though, is that fire-based torture was deeply rooted in ancient punitive rituals. Execution by burning wasn't rare. Witches in later centuries would find this out the hard way. But the Brazen Bull, if real, offered something extra: spectacle. Imagine the theater of it. Citizens gathered to watch. Musicians playing. Maybe snacks were sold. All while someone slowly cooked inside a brass animal. Screams turned into concertos of agony. And you thought movie theaters had bad sound design. The heat inside the bull would rise rapidly. Skin would blister. Air would turn to steam. Metal, as you might have noticed, is a fantastic conductor. There would be no escape, no comfortable position to die in. You'd writhe and slam against the searing walls, every movement just accelerating your own pain. The heady scent of burning flesh, acrid and unmistakable, would escape through the nose holes like an offering to the gods of cruelty. There's a fringe theory that the bull might have been used more than once, with its interior becoming coated in blackened, greasy residue from previous victims. Which would mean you weren't just being roasted, you were being reheated in someone else's suffering. Lovely. Oddly enough, in certain Roman and later Christian writings, the brazen bull took on symbolic meaning. It became shorthand for tyranny, used to describe not just physical pain but spiritual corruption. A gleaming idol that offered punishment disguised as beauty. But make no mistake, the idea of the brazen bull stuck around, whether it was real or mythologized. Later torture devices, including some horrifying contraptions in medieval Europe and imperial China, borrowed the same principle. Use of metal, fire, and confined space to destroy a body in stages. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some versions of the story, after the victim was cooked, the body would be removed, and their bones polished to a pearly sheen by the heat. These bones were allegedly turned into bracelets or ceremonial objects. A little keepsake for the executioner's mantle. Now let's not forget Perillos, the original idea guy. According to one version of the tale, he survived his initial trial run, barely. Phalaris pulled him out, burned but alive, and then tossed him off a cliff anyway. Classic ancient overkill. As you stand now, gazing at the bull's frozen metallic snarl, you can't help but feel that chill again, despite the heat. This wasn't just punishment. It was a warning. A way for rulers to say, we don't just kill you. We make music from your pain. The scary part? People applauded. There's something unsettling about how often public torture became entertainment. In ancient Greece, in Rome, and yes, even in more modern times, watching someone suffer wasn't seen as grotesque, it was afternoon recreation. Something to gather around, talk about, maybe place bets on. Gladiators got it better. At least they had a fighting chance. You try to imagine crawling inside that bull. You press your palms to the interior, and it's already hot, too hot. You panic before the fire even starts. Your breath rebounds off the metal. Your voice turns strange, hollow, distorted. You scream, and it doesn't even sound like you anymore. And in that moment, you realize something. This wasn't about crime. It wasn't about justice. The brazen bull, like so many torture methods to come, was about domination, control, not just over your body, but over the sound of your soul. A prison you can hear. You stumble out of the sun-scorched plaza, ears still ringing from phantom screams echoing through bronze. The ground shifts again, stone morphing into cracked, dusty tiles beneath your bare feet. Now, you're somewhere darker, crueler, and strangely, quieter. There are no crowds this time. No trumpeting bull. Just you, some ropes, and a piece of furniture that's far too pointy to sit on. Welcome to the world of the Judas Cradle, a torture device so personal, it makes everything you've endured so far feel like foreplay. You're led forward, trembling. The torturer gestures to what looks like an oversized wooden pyramid mounted on a frame. It comes to a narrow, vicious point. No bloodstains. Yet. He doesn't explain. He doesn't need to. Because you already know, you're not supposed to sit on it. But you're going to. The Judas Cradle, or Culla di Guida in Italian, was a staple of certain inquisitorial torture chambers in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. Its method was simple. Suspend the victim above the pyramid by ropes or chains, usually tied at the wrists or around the waist. Lower them, slowly, onto the point, allowing it to press into extremely sensitive areas. Usually the anus. Sometimes the genitals. Occasionally the mouth. And when the ropes slackened just enough, gravity did the rest. You dangle above the pyramid now. Muscles aching. Skin prickled with fear. You feel the point brushing against you, sharp and uncaring. A little more weight, a little more time, and the human body becomes its own torture instrument. Splitting, tearing, trembling. No blades. No flames. Just geometry. Historians still argue whether the Judas cradle was a widespread device or a regional curiosity. Some suggest it was primarily used in Italy and Spain. Others think it was more of a psychological weapon, kept in the corner of the room, its silhouette doing most of the damage. But a few preserved examples do exist in museums, and they're every bit as horrifying as you'd imagine. Mainstream fact: the Catholic Inquisition did use physical torture to extract confessions, though often with strict rules. Torture was supposed to be brief, non-lethal, and never repeated. Of course, that's like telling someone to only use a little pepper spray. In practice, these rules were easily bent, especially when a confession could mean salvation, or just the end of screaming. The Judas cradle had another layer of horror. It was rarely cleaned between uses. So the sharp wooden tip, splintered and worn, was a breeding ground for infection. Victims who didn't die from trauma or shock might spend days afterward dying from sepsis. There's a fringe theory that some torturers deliberately dirted the tip with dung or rotten meat, adding biological warfare to an already nightmarish device. And now here's the kicker: sometimes they bounced you. A little up, a little down. Let the tip do its thing. The goal wasn't death. It was humiliation, agony, and spiritual collapse. You'd confess to things you'd never even heard of. You'd name names just to stop the slow, wretched descent. One documented account tells of a man accused of heresy who spent nearly 3 hours suspended above the pyramid. He passed out multiple times. When revived, he immediately confessed, and then spent the rest of his life disfigured, unable to sit or walk properly. But not every pyramid was tall. Some were short, squat, designed to penetrate shallowly but still exert pressure over hours. Others were greased with oil or lard for easier entry, a detail that's both disturbingly considerate and disgustingly efficient. Let's take a step back. It's easy to get lost in the mechanics, but what really sets this device apart is the message. The Judas cradle didn't just cause pain, it mocked the victim. You were lowered onto it like a rag doll, stripped of all dignity, every muscle working against gravity. And the triangle beneath you, it doesn't care. It just waits. There's a quiet, almost clinical brutality in how this method plays out. Unlike the rack or the wheel, there's no sudden snap. Just a gradual, inevitable piercing, like being erased from the inside out. And yet, here's your quirky historical footnote. Some 19th century pranksters allegedly created fake medieval Judas cradles to sell to museums hungry for spooky relics. That means some of what we see today might actually be the result of Victorian gothcore hobbyists carving torture furniture in their garages. Charming. But you're not thinking about that right now. You're sweating. Breathing shallow. Your arms are tied above your head, and the rope's getting shorter. You're slipping, inch by inch, and there's nothing to catch you but that single, unforgiving spike. No crowd. No ceremony. Just a low creak of wood, a sharp gasp, and a sudden bloom of white-hot pain that starts deep and spreads outward like a poison flower. You hang there for a moment, hovering between agony and surrender. Your mind reaches for something, anything, to make sense of the pain. A memory. A prayer. A joke. Here's one for you. Don't worry, it only really hurts the first few inches. You're still trembling when the ropes vanish, the pyramid fades, and a new kind of cold slides across your skin. Stone again, but older now. Cruder. You smell mildew, iron, and something else. Burnt wood, maybe? Your arms are shackled above you, toes barely brushing the floor, and there's a strange tension in the air. This time, the pain isn't waiting. It's already here, curled into the ancient joints of your shoulders. Welcome to the strappado, also known as corda, one of the most deceptively simple and devastating tortures ever invented. Because all it needs is a rope, a ceiling beam, and time. You glance upward. The rope runs through a pulley. The torturer stands beside it, relaxed, almost bored. He jerks the cord. You rise off the ground, and your shoulders explode with pain. That's it. That's the whole method. You're hoisted up by the wrists behind your back, arms twisted unnaturally. Then, he lets you drop. Not to the ground. Just a few feet. Enough to jolt the entire weight of your body onto your twisted arms, wrenching your shoulders, tearing ligaments, maybe even dislocating the joints entirely. The screaming? That's just your body realizing it's being taken apart. Slowly, precisely, and without blood. The strapado was especially popular during the Renaissance, favored by the Spanish Inquisition, various European inquisitors, and even civil courts. It was the perfect torture tool for institutions obsessed with rules. No knives, no fire, nothing technically mutilated. Just a persuasive technique to help the accused tell the truth. Historians still argue whether the strapado caused more psychological damage than physical. For some, it was the anticipation that unraveled them, the knowledge that the next drop might finally snap something that doesn't grow back. For others, it was the public nature of it. You weren't tortured in secret. You were strung up in front of everyone, judges, clergy, even family. You swing gently now, toes curling, arms throbbing. The torturer raises the rope again. Another drop. Maybe the second dislocates both shoulders. If not, the third will. You scream, but the pulley squeaks louder. Mainstream historical fact: Leonardo da Vinci himself drew diagrams of strapado-style devices. In a time obsessed with anatomy, science, and symmetry, torture was just another system to be refined. You weren't just a soul on trial. You were a machine being stress-tested. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some records show that torturers added weights to the ankles for extra persuasion. Just imagine, your arms stretched skyward, your body yanked down. The human frame doesn't like being a wishbone. The elegance of the strapado lies in its silence. No clanging chains. No roaring flames. Just creaking rope and the soft pop of ligaments unraveling. Torturers often took their time. Lift you. Drop you. Ask a question. Wait. Repeat. Sometimes for hours. There's a variant called the reverse strapado, where the victim was hoisted upside down, wrists still bound behind the back. This version added dizziness, head pressure, and, if the torturer was feeling spicy, a few taps to the head with a club, just to keep you from passing out too soon. Even more chilling, some chambers combined strapado with water torture. Between drops, the accused would be doused in cold water to revive them, or dunked headfirst until they confessed, or inhaled their silence. You're thinking it now, aren't you? Could you handle it? Could you take just one drop? Just one brutal tug on your shoulders before you told them everything they wanted to hear. That's the genius of the method. You didn't have to die. You just had to agree. That was enough. You glance down at your wrists. They're already red and swollen. Your fingers tingle. Blood flow. Interrupted. Muscles. Screaming. And through it all, you hear voices. Priests, judges, scribes, debating your fate as if you weren't even here. Just a body dangling in the middle of the room. A thing to be written about, recorded, filed away. Historians today debate the numbers. How many were tortured this way? How many were falsely accused? But the true horror is in how normal it all was. The strapado wasn't just accepted, it was routine. A line on a checklist. Step 3. Dangle for 2 hours. Step 4. Confession. Eventually, your shoulders stop hurting. Not because the pain is gone, because your nerves have given up. That's often the last stage. A numbness that signals something irreversible. Here's a final whisper of irony. Many victims weren't executed afterward. Once they confessed, they were released, often with permanent injuries. You might have gone in a heretic and come out a cripple. But hey, you were free, right? Except you'd never lift your arms above your head again. Never reach out, hug someone, or raise a child. The rope had taken something from you. Quietly, permanently. And that's the thing with this kind of torture. It doesn't announce itself like the bull or the pyramid. It doesn't leave obvious scars. But you'll feel it. Every time you move. Every time it rains. Every time you try to forget. You swing gently, like a broken puppet, waiting for the next drop. The ropes dissolve like smoke, and you're left crumpled on a dusty floor. Every muscle shakes. Your shoulders scream with each breath. But there's no time to rest. Shadows flicker along a narrow corridor as you're dragged, yes, dragged, toward a door you know shouldn't be opened. You've arrived at the chamber of the rack, perhaps the most infamous torture device in history. And tonight, you'll understand exactly why. This room is colder than the last. Quieter, too. Not the heavy, watchful silence of a courtroom, but something darker. Resigned. As though the walls have long since absorbed every cry, every pop, every final, gasping breath. The rack waits in the center. Just a simple wooden table, long and grim, with rollers at either end and thick ropes attached. It almost looks like an oversized medieval massage bench. Until you see the notches carved into the wood, some accidental, some deliberate. Teeth marks. Nail gouges. Reminders. Your wrists and ankles are tied with brutal efficiency. The torturer doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. Because you know what comes next. One roller is turned, slowly, then again. Your limbs tighten. Ankles downward, wrists upward. Another turn. And another. Skin pulls taut. You try to shift your body, but you're already stretched, too far. One more crank, and the pain slams into you. It doesn't build. It erupts, as if your entire body just snapped awake in protest. This is the rack's genius. It doesn't slice or burn. It just pulls, methodically, relentlessly, stretching you until tendons scream and joints decide they've had enough. Your elbows ache like shattered glass. Your knees feel as if they've been unscrewed from the inside. Mainstream historical fact. The rack was used extensively across Europe from the Middle Ages through the early modern era. The Tower of London had a particularly well-documented version nicknamed the Duke of Exeter's Daughter. Sweet name, right? Nothing like being dismembered by aristocratic metaphors. The earliest racks appeared during the Inquisition, but the device really flourished during political purges, when kings wanted names, confessions, and elaborate plots to justify their paranoia. Victims were often interrogated mid-stretch, as their minds danced between lucidity and agony. One of the most infamous cases. Guy Fawkes. Yes, that Guy Fawkes, the man behind the gunpowder plot of 1605. After his arrest, he was racked so severely that his signature became almost illegible. The difference between his pre- and post-torture handwriting? Like comparing a firm handshake to a ghost's whisper. Historians still argue whether the rack was a final option or a frequent first step. Some records suggest that courts often used it early, believing that a little stretch could bring clarity of mind. Others claim it was saved for the most stubborn or dangerous, a tool of desperation when subtler methods failed. Now, a quirky tidbit for you. The word rack became slang in later centuries for any overwhelming strain or torment. Even poets used it metaphorically. Shakespeare wrote of the rack of this tough world. Little did he know, for some, the metaphor was far too literal. You're still on the table, ropes groaning with tension. Your limbs feel impossibly long. Your back arches. Your spine protests. And then, crank. Just one more. Enough to push your joints past the edge. You don't hear them pop. You feel it. Shoulders dislocate. Hips pull free. Knees twist unnaturally. You want to pass out, but the pain holds you upright in some perverse kind of consciousness. Your body is a puppet, stretched on invisible strings. Here's a moment of gallows humor for you. Some torturers would test the rack by placing a coin on the victim's belly. When the coin flipped from tension, they knew they were getting close to the limit. Science. Some racks came with foot rollers lined with spikes, designed to twist the soles as your legs were pulled. A multitasking nightmare. You weren't just being stretched, you were being shaped. Like clay with a heartbeat. Occasionally, a doctor stood by to keep you alive longer. Not for mercy, mind you, just to ensure you could confess after the worst damage had been done. Confession under torture was legally dubious, so the trick was to hurt you, stop, then ask questions while you were lucid, but still broken. And make no mistake, most people did confess. Truth became malleable under strain. You'd admit to heresy, sorcery, plotting against the king, or invent names just to make it stop. Entire networks of imaginary conspirators were born on the rack, spun from tendons and trauma. Some unlucky victims were stretched beyond recognition, arms torn from sockets, rib cages cracked. If the pain didn't kill you, infection might. If not infection, paralysis. And if not that, well, you'd live, but only technically. Let's not forget the psychological weight. You knew it was coming. Days beforehand, you'd hear it, wheels turning, prisoners screaming. You'd beg to be burned instead. At least fire has an endpoint. But the rack, it doesn't end. It elongates. Even now, you lie motionless, stretched like a shadow at dusk. The pain no longer sharp, but heavy, pervasive. Your limbs no longer belong to you. They float somewhere else, beyond the edge of your breath. You've been dismantled, not in pieces, but in proportions. The torturer stops. He unties you, and your arms flop to the sides like rope. You don't move. You can't. The floor is closer now, but only because you're longer than you used to be. And as you're dragged away from the rack's embrace, you realize something cruel. It never wanted to kill you. It just wanted to open you up, like a book. And oh, what stories you've told. You slump to the floor, limbs too long, nerves too loud. But there's no time for pity, not here. Your breath fogs in the cold air, the silence now broken by the soft flicker of flame. You don't even need to look up to know what's waiting next. Because if the rack was slow and mechanical, this one is personal. Chaotic. Intimate in a way that makes your skin crawl. Welcome to the era of hot irons and branding, where pain wasn't just felt, it was permanently inscribed. You're strapped upright now, your back pressed against rough wood. It's damp, reeking faintly of old blood and smoke. A brazier glows nearby, metal rods standing upright inside it like fingers warming by the fire. Each one has a different shape, a hook, a poker, a coil, a brand. The torturer lifts one. A small, curved S. It hisses softly as it leaves the coals. He doesn't look at you, he doesn't have to. His eyes are fixed on the tip of the rod, watching the metal shift from orange to white hot. You know what's coming, but you still flinch when it touches your flesh. The pain isn't sharp. Not at first. It blooms, wide, unstoppable, deep. You don't scream immediately. Your mouth opens, your body jerks, but the sound arrives late, buried under the sizzling. That smell? That's your skin. Cooking. Branding was common punishment in ancient and medieval legal systems. Thieves might get a T on the forehead. Slaves, sometimes F for fugitivus, runaway. Heretics, witches, deserters, all carefully labeled, like rotten food in a pantry. A public mark of shame, pain, and proof. Mainstream historical fact. Under French law during the 17th and 18th centuries, criminals could be branded with a fleur-de-lis, burned into their shoulders or cheeks. This was before the French Revolution decided guillotines were a more democratic option. But branding wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it was preemptive torture, used to soften prisoners before interrogation. A few burn marks to encourage honesty. If they confessed, great. If not, well, the branding iron was already warm. You might think, branding's bad, but at least it's quick, right? That depends. Because here's your quirky tidbit. Some torturers use specially engraved metal stamps not to press, but to carve the flesh as it burned. Meaning not only were you scorched, you were literally cut with fire. Others went freestyle, drawing designs or initials directly onto the skin using red-hot wires, pressing and dragging like cruel artists with living canvases. You didn't just hurt. You became a gallery piece. Historians still argue whether branding functioned more as deterrent or domination. Was it a warning to the masses? Or a badge of ownership by the state, like branding cattle? Either way, the result was the same. You didn't walk away as a person anymore. You walked away as a marked thing. Back in the room, your body convulses with each touch of the iron. The torturer swaps tools now, each with its own special signature. Some round, some jagged. One shaped like a crescent moon. Maybe symbolic. Maybe just aesthetic. And it wasn't always one and done. Sometimes you'd be branded, then whipped along the burn to punish you for twitching. Sometimes they'd press the same spot twice, to make sure it stuck. You weren't just enduring pain, you were being rewritten, one letter at a time. There's a whispered legend that medieval inquisitors had a branding iron shaped like a cross, used only during Lent. You were purified by fire, they said. As if searing pain could lead to salvation. Sometimes, they'd heat tongs instead, pulling them from the fire and gripping the victim's limbs, cheeks, or genitals. Flesh would hiss, blister, and sometimes slough off entirely. You were gripped like bread from an oven, except you were the bread. And you weren't done baking. One famous case. Jeanne de Brigue, accused of witchcraft in 1390s France. After confession under torture, she was branded before execution. Not just for punishment, but to prove the evil had been marked and exposed. The fire didn't just punish, it purified. Some towns had branding days, public spectacles where criminals were burned before the crowd. Kids would cheer, adults would wince. The iron made its mark, then was cleaned for the next. Efficient, theatrical, revolting. You look down now, barely able to see through the steam. Your chest heaves. Your skin is no longer skin. Blistered ridges rise like maps, twisted letters half burned into your side. Maybe it's your name. Maybe it's a message. In some places, branding was paired with ear cropping, where parts of the ear were sliced off post-burn to further shame the criminal. A scar to say, "Don't trust this one." As if you'd need reminding. Later, some branding irons evolved with spring triggers, to make perfect impressions quickly. One click, one burn. Industrialized pain. Iron meets flesh. Justice served. Next. In early America, branding remained common. You might see SL for slave, or M for manslaughter. In some cases, it was done after execution, branding the body to send a final message. Death wasn't enough. You had to carry guilt beyond the grave. Even today, echoes remain. The idea that pain plus public shame equals justice hasn't gone away. Just changed form. Your torturer finally sets the iron down. You're slumped in the restraints, body steaming, skin twitching. The smell of char lingers in your nose, clinging to your tongue. You're not just hurt. You're changed. You'll carry this with you now. Even if you survive, even if you run, someone will see. Someone will ask. And the story will begin again. Because some tortures don't just break you in the moment. They keep talking. Every time you look in a mirror, they whisper, "Remember." Your skin still smolders when you're led down a spiral stairwell, each step like a slap to your scorched nerves. The air is thick here, metallic and sour. You descend into silence, and suddenly, you're not walking anymore. You're falling. Or floating. The line blurs as the floor vanishes and the darkness begins to hum. Welcome to the Iron Maiden and other closing horrors, where torture becomes not just a spectacle, but a cruel mockery of safety. Because what's more terrifying than a coffin that hugs you back, with spikes? You're standing now in front of the Iron Maiden itself. She's tall, cold, feminine in silhouette. Her doors are slightly ajar, like an invitation, or a dare. Polished iron, flecked with old rust, maybe old blood. Inside, spikes. Dozens. Not long enough to kill you quickly, but just enough to pierce. Chest. Stomach. Thighs. Eyes, if they're feeling generous. You're nudged forward, and the door groans open, just wide enough for you to see yourself reflected in the warped steel. Then you're inside. The metal hugs your shoulders, presses against your legs. The door closes with a click, gentle, almost affectionate. And then, pressure. Tiny pinpricks first. Then deep, urgent bites. Your body spasms, but there's no room to thrash. Every twitch sinks you further into steel kisses. It's claustrophobia with teeth. Mainstream historical fact: despite popular imagery, the Iron Maiden may not have been widely used during the Middle Ages. The most famous example, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was likely a 19th century creation, constructed as a dramatic prop inspired by earlier tales. In other words, it may have been more theatre than tool. But earlier civilizations did use similar devices. Bronze sarcophagi with nails, spike-lined boxes, upright cages. So while the Iron Maiden herself may be more fiction than function, the idea she represents was very, very real. Your quirky tidbit for this ride? Some versions of the Iron Maiden included a strategically placed spike at chest level, not to kill, but to barely miss the heart. Close enough to stab terror through your ribs, but far enough to prolong the agony. Precision pain. Historians still argue whether the Iron Maiden was ever used on living prisoners or merely as psychological torture, a looming warning that this could happen to you. A medieval boogeyman, its horror lying not in experience but imagination. But don't worry, we're not done. Because if metal coffins weren't your thing, there were other closing contraptions. You're shoved from the Maiden, blood oozing from your punctures like slow tears, and dragged toward the scavenger's daughter. Sounds poetic, right? Like maybe a lullaby or a tragic play. Nope. It's a folding metal torture frame developed in Tudor England, a kind of cruel origami for humans. Here's how it works. Instead of stretching your body like the rack, this one compresses it. Your head, arms, and legs are strapped tightly, then folded inward like a closing pocket knife. Knees to chest, chest to knees, face smashed between. Pain blossoms inward. Bones grind against bones. Blood vessels burst in your face. Your ears ring, not from sound, but from pressure. Victims often emerged, if they emerged at all, covered in bruises, bleeding from the nose, eyes, and ears. The scavenger's daughter squeezed not just your body, but your dignity. Why the name? Another joke in the form of irony. Scavenger is a corruption of Skevington, the inventor's surname. So really, it's Skevington's daughter. But that sounds less dramatic, doesn't it? There's more. They strap you in again. This time, you're placed inside a metal cage, barely wider than your shoulders, suspended from a hook in the ceiling. This isn't about pain now. This is about time. You hang there for days. No movement. No food. No rest. Your muscles seize. Flies find you. Your own breath becomes unbearable. And if the weather changes, cold or heat, the metal cage amplifies it like an oven or an icebox. This was known as gibbeting, and it was usually done after execution. Bodies hung as warnings, left to rot in public view. But sometimes, the person was still alive. One famous case. A French pirate named François L'Olonnais was caged alive by enemies who left him out for birds to pick at. He lasted 2 days, screaming. Eventually, silence won. And here's your fringe detail. Some cages were custom fit, like medieval tailored suits. They'd bend iron around your exact body shape, so if you slumped or moved even slightly, snap, dislocation, or worse. By now, your sense of time is gone. You blink, and you're back on the stone floor, the Iron Maiden glaring at you with closed eyes. She'll wait. She always does. You've learned something crucial here. Not all torture is about speed. Some is about containment. About giving you just enough space to feel yourself slowly unraveling. It's not about breaking bones. It's about compressing the soul until it folds, quietly, without a sound. And as you lie there, your skin etched by metal, your breath shallow, you can almost hear it, the whisper of hinges behind you. Something's opening. And something else is waiting to close. You're not quite sure how long it's been. Time is thick now, congealed, like the blood crusted on your thighs. But the torchlight shifts again, flickering toward a corridor that smells oddly familiar. Not metallic this time, but sharp, sickly. Like rotting hay. Like filth. Like fear fermented. You're dragged forward, ankles grazing the stone floor, until you arrive at what looks like a narrow trough carved into the earth. And perched beside it, serene as a sleeping cow, is a bucket. A heavy lid rests nearby. You tilt your head, confused, until the torturer lifts the lid. Inside the bucket is a rat. Welcome to the rat torture chambers, where panic becomes a predator, and your belly is about to become someone else's escape route. You're laid down flat, wrists tied above your head, ankles bound tight. The torturer places the open bucket on your bare abdomen, the rat squirming inside, sniffing. Then the lid goes on, tightly sealed except for the open bottom now pressed against your stomach. And then, the coals. The brazier returns, but this time it's not for your skin. It's placed gently atop the bucket. Within seconds, the metal heats. The rat screeches. You feel the bucket shift. Scratch. Scratch, scratch. See, rats don't like heat. They flee it instinctively. But with the top sealed shut, there's only one way out. Through you. Mainstream historical fact. Rat torture was documented during the Dutch Revolt in the 16th century. Captain Diederik Sonoy, a lieutenant of William of Orange, was said to have employed this method on Catholic prisoners, strapping a pottery bowl full of rats to their abdomen and heating it until the animals began to burrow. You feel it now. Claws. Tiny. Desperate. Furious. A sudden bite. Then another. The rat isn't attacking you. It's just trying to survive. But survival, in this case, means excavating your insides. You scream. Of course you do. You writhe, pulling at the ropes. But the only thing you manage is to jostle the bucket, and that makes the rat even more frantic. Scratch. Bite. Tear. Chew. And here's your quirky tidbit. In 18th century Hungary, some versions used starved rats. Not for escape, but hunger. A starving rat trapped on your chest would begin to chew out of sheer desperation, beginning with the softest tissue it could reach, your belly button. Congratulations. Your lunch. Historians still argue whether this technique was widely used or reserved for rare, unofficial interrogations. Some claim it was more urban legend than institutional practice. Others point to multiple references in both European and Asian archives that suggest it was more common than we like to admit. What's certain is that once imagined, it became the stuff of nightmares. You try to hold still, but every move seems to agitate the creature. Its teeth scrape bone now. You're crying openly, not just from pain, but from violation. This isn't just torture. This is invasion. You're no longer a person. You're a corridor. And once the rat starts, there's no undoing it. In South America, variations included using large rodents, capybaras or parkas, inside wooden boxes, strapped to the prisoner's chest. Fires would be lit beneath the wood, and in one recorded case, the animal gnawed a hole through a man's liver before it was stopped. The box was pulled away only to reveal wriggling intestines, and a very confused, mildly cooked rodent. Another version, the bamboo cage technique. In ancient China, thin bamboo spears were placed beneath a cage of rats tied to a victim's bare torso. As the rats grew agitated, they would dig downward, pushing the bamboo through the flesh themselves, unintentionally driving the spears deeper. But maybe the most chilling part of rat torture isn't the execution, it's the aftermath. Some victims lived. Some bore scars where the rats stopped short of death. But they were never quite the same. Because when an animal has tunneled through your body, no prayer, no balm, no time can unknow that fact. You blink now through sweat. You feel the bucket lifted. The rat, twitching, blooded, and wild, leaps free and disappears into the darkness, leaving you hollow. Literally. You lie still. Not because you're brave, but because you're afraid to discover what's missing inside. And the chamber. It's quiet again. For now. But don't relax too much. The worst thing about animals is, they reproduce. You hear it before you see it. A faint squeak. Then another. And a second bucket is brought in, larger this time. Because once a method works, it rarely stops with one. The second rat never arrives. Not today, anyway. You've proven your point. Or maybe you've just passed out again. Your body's internal alarm system finally pulling the plug on consciousness to save what's left of you. But when your eyes reopen, you're moving. Carried. The familiar scrape of stone gives way to something softer. Wood. You're outdoors now, or near it. The air is different, damp, but fresh. You catch glimpses of sky through crooked beams above. And before you can lift your head, you're dropped onto something sharp. It's straw, mixed with splinters, and urine, and something else. You've just entered the stage of public spectacle tortures, where pain meets performance, and your suffering becomes someone else's Sunday afternoon entertainment. They strip you again, modesty left somewhere back in the rat room, and bind your arms behind a thick wooden post. The ground beneath you is stained in concentric circles, a ghostly record of those who've knelt here before. A crowd forms. Quiet murmurs rise into laughter, then a collective hush. They're waiting for the show to begin. Mainstream historical fact. Public executions and torture sessions were not just forms of punishment, they were events. In medieval Europe, crowds often gathered in the thousands for hangings, floggings, or even quarterings. Vendors sold snacks. Artists sketched caricatures. Children cheered. A few feet away stands the pillory, that infamous wooden frame with 3 holes, 1 for your neck, 2 for your wrists. A medieval selfie frame, but instead of filters, you get vegetables lobbed at your face. And sometimes worse. They drag you over, fit your limbs into place, and clamp the wood down tight. You can't move. Can't duck. Your chin juts forward helplessly, drool pooling at the edge of your lips. The first tomato hits your cheek. Then a cabbage. Then, well, that wasn't food. It smells like a latrine and feels like a direct message. You flinch, to no avail. The audience roars with delight. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some French towns, repeat offenders were chained to a rotating pillory that turned every hour so the sun would scorch every side of their face evenly. One poor baker who watered down his wine was left turning like a roast chicken for 2 full days. But if you're truly unpopular, they upgrade you to the stocks, the seated cousin of the pillory, often with added shackles for the feet. There, you're not just trapped. You're still, which gives people more time to aim, or to whisper, or to invent new things to throw. And then, the real theater begins. You're brought to a platform. Ropes dangle from wooden arms like vines. This isn't just public shaming. It's the whipping post. The executioner steps up. Shirtless, tanned, with muscles like knotted ropes and eyes that don't blink. You tense, but not from fear, from memory. You've seen what lashes do. You know the snap of leather. And you know the first one is the worst, because it wakes every nerve. Crack. Your spine arches. Crack. You taste blood. Crack. The crowd applauds. It's a matinee, and you're the lead. Historians still argue whether the brutality of public punishments deterred crime or simply normalized it. Some records suggest crime increased in towns with frequent public floggings, as if violence begets violence. Others claim it kept order with ruthless efficiency. What's not in debate? People loved to watch. And it wasn't just in Europe. In 18th century Japan, criminals were paraded through towns before execution, dressed in humiliating garb, sometimes forced to sing or dance while guards beat drums behind them. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, public amputations drew crowds who treated them like religious rites. There's something universal, apparently, about our fascination with pain that isn't ours. You collapse, body trembling, but you're not allowed to leave the stage yet. They've saved the grand finale, the wheel. It's massive, wood reinforced with iron, almost beautiful in its craftsmanship. Your tied spread eagle to the spokes. Your arms make a perfect Y. Your legs shake. Then the mallet comes. Not sharp, not fast, just heavy. Each swing is designed to break a bone without severing it. To crush, not slice. They start at your legs. Fibula first. Then tibia. Your limbs flop like puppet strings as the bones shatter, one by one. The audience holds its breath, then erupts again. And then, your body, still alive, is left there, twisted, wrapped around the wheel like some grotesque clock. Time, in this moment, seems to belong to you. And everyone watching. Want a horror footnote? In parts of Germany and France, the wheel was sometimes raised on a pole and left for days. Birds would come. Children would gather. And the sun would do the rest. You hang now in silence. The crowd's interest wanes. A child asks for bread. Someone starts packing up their apples. The show is over. And yet, you're still here. Still bound to the great wheel, a spiral of splintered limbs and public judgment. You've learned something crucial tonight, that humiliation hurts, not just in your skin, but in your identity. That being watched while you break can feel worse than breaking alone. And as twilight descends and the crowd fades, your body cooling against iron and wood, you hear only one sound. Applause, still echoing, somewhere in your memory. The evening air chills as you're finally released, limbs numb, pride shredded. But rest isn't in the cards. Instead, you're marched into a different chamber, one that smells of damp earth and bitter herbs. You notice the walls here are rough-hewn stone, but the ceiling dips low, pressing down like a heavy breath. Your footsteps echo hollowly. Ahead stands a tall, ominous apparatus, the breaking wheel's cruel sibling, the pair of anguish. You clutch your aching ribs, but this is a different kind of torture, one that targets what you say as much as what you feel. The pair looks like a twisted, rusty cone made of segments that expand and contract like a mechanical flower designed by a sadist with engineering skills. It's small enough to fit into a mouth, an orifice, or a cavity. It's designed to open wide, slowly, inexorably. You're forced to lie down, head tilted back. The torturer greets you with a sinister smile, slides the pair in, carefully, and then, with a slow turn of the screw, begins expanding its metallic petals. A sickening crunch sounds from inside you. The pain radiates out like wildfire. Your mouth stretches unnaturally, or your orifice widens in impossible ways. It feels like being slowly eaten alive from the inside out. Mainstream historical fact: the pair of anguish was a device reportedly used in the 17th century, primarily for punishing moral crimes like blasphemy, adultery, or heresy. It was inserted into the mouth, anus, or vagina, then expanded to cause tearing and internal damage. Its actual historical usage is debated. Some scholars argue it's more legend than fact, as few authentic devices have survived. Others cite confessions and court records referencing its horror. A quirky tidbit: some versions of the pair had detachable spikes that would rotate when expanded, turning the agony into a slow, grinding torture, like a medieval jack-in-the-box of terror. You try to scream, but the device distorts your jaw. Words come out as a garbled croak. Your mind splits between unbearable pain and shame, a tangled knot that tightens with every turn. The torturer, smiling faintly, spins the screw again. Historians still argue whether the pair was more symbolic than practical, meant to terrify prisoners into confession rather than being commonly employed. Some believe it was used mainly for public humiliation, while others suggest it was a rare, last resort method. But regardless, it makes a strong point. Torture didn't only maim bodies, it could silence voices. After what feels like an eternity, the device retracts. Your mouth, or whatever cavity, feels raw, bleeding, and alien. You gasp, struggling to breathe. You realize torture isn't just about physical pain, it's about control. About breaking not only the body but your will to resist, your sense of self. And just when you think the worst is behind you, the torturer drags you to another device, smaller, uglier, the Spanish tickler. It's a metal claw with sharp hooks designed to rip flesh. They don't crush bones but tear through skin, creating ragged wounds meant to bleed endlessly. They rake it over your arms, torso, legs. The pain is a searing rasp, burning like fire ants crawling under your skin. This tool was common in the Inquisition, its name ironically soft. The tickler was anything but gentle, designed for slow torture, not quick death. You shudder with every scrape. Your body convulses involuntarily. You try to remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we joked about earlier, to somehow protect your skin in this nightmare, but it's useless now. These instruments are part of a system designed to extract confessions, punish dissent, and entertain the authorities. You're left bleeding on the floor, your voice hoarse, your spirit fragmented. But your ordeal isn't done yet. As your vision dims, you hear the faint, sinister clink of chains. You're being moved again, toward a cold pool. And a question echoes in your mind. How much more can the body really take? The cold water slaps your face, dragging you back from the edge of unconsciousness. You gasp, trying to orient yourself, but your body is weak and trembling. Your clothes are soaked, and your skin prickles as the chill creeps beneath the layers. Around you, the damp stone walls glisten in the flickering torchlight, casting monstrous shadows that seem to dance just out of reach. You're strapped down, wrists and ankles bound tight, and lowered into what feels like a narrow pool, just deep enough to cover your chin when lying back. Welcome to the dreaded world of water torture, where drowning and suffocation masquerade as punishment and interrogation. You struggle to stay calm as your head dips below the surface, lungs screaming for air. Just as panic tightens its grip, you're pulled up abruptly, barely able to draw a breath before it starts all over again. The cycle repeats, each immersion a harrowing journey to the brink of death. Mainstream historical fact: water torture, including the infamous waterboarding, dates back centuries and was used by many regimes, from the Spanish Inquisition to colonial powers interrogating prisoners. Victims often describe the sensation as drowning without dying, a slow, torturous suffocation. You learn quickly that it's not the water itself that kills, but the terror of losing control, your body's primal scream for oxygen drowned out by endless immersion. Here's a quirky tidbit. In 17th century Europe, a device called a ducking stool was used both to punish and test accused witches, dunking them repeatedly in cold water. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent, albeit dead. If they floated, they were guilty and subjected to further torment. Talk about a lose-lose situation. Historians still argue whether the ducking stool was a genuine form of justice or simply a public spectacle to satisfy superstitions and paranoia. Some scholars suggest many accused witches were victims of misogyny and social scapegoating rather than actual crimes. As your lungs burn and your vision blurs, you notice the rhythm of the torturer's work. Not random, but deliberate, calculating the moments between air and submersion to maximize psychological torment. Water torture is cruel because it plays with your mind as much as your body. It exploits your innate fear of drowning, that ultimate loss of control. In another variation, prisoners were forced to drink copious amounts of water, leading to painful bloating and sometimes fatal water intoxication. The body, overwhelmed by excess fluid, began to shut down. You begin to understand, torture is a science as much as an art, carefully calibrated to break resistance without killing too quickly. A voice echoes faintly from somewhere behind the stone walls, an old prayer or a sob. You try to whisper along, but your throat is raw. The cycle continues: dip, gasp, choke, gasp, dip. And somewhere in this endless loop, you realize that your mind becomes a battleground. Panic tries to claim the throne, but somewhere deep inside, a stubborn flicker of hope refuses to be snuffed. You grip that flicker. Cling to it. Because if your mind breaks first, the body doesn't stand a chance. And the water keeps coming. Your body shudders in the cold, the last droplets clinging to your skin like icy spiders' webs. The water torture was merciless, but it was only a prelude to what comes next, the infamous Iron Maiden. You're dragged, half-conscious now, through narrow stone corridors that smell of rust and decay. The air grows heavier, charged with a silent menace that presses on your chest like a physical weight. Then you're thrown into a chamber lit only by a single flickering torch. Before you stands a giant iron coffin, shaped eerily like a woman. The Iron Maiden. You stare at the grim facade. The door swings open slowly, groaning like a dying beast. The inside is lined with spikes, long, cruel, sharpened to a terrifying precision. They're positioned so that when the door closes, the spikes would pierce your flesh but avoid vital organs, promising a slow, agonizing death. You're forced inside. The door creaks shut behind you, cold iron pressing against your skin, spikes sinking just enough to remind you of their presence. Mainstream historical fact: the Iron Maiden is often cited as a quintessential medieval torture device, but historians still debate its actual use. Some argue it was a myth, a 19th century invention to evoke medieval horror, while others point to earlier mentions suggesting it may have existed in some form. Here's a quirky tidbit. The earliest known iron coffin was found in Nuremberg, Germany, dating back to the late 16th century, but some claim it was more a showpiece than a functional device. Still, the image of being locked inside a metal sarcophagus with spikes has become a cultural symbol of torment. Historians still argue whether the Iron Maiden was a genuine instrument of torture or primarily a tool for propaganda and fear-mongering. Inside the device, you struggle to breathe, the spikes pressing deeper with every movement. The air is thick and stale, panic claws at your throat. Your muscles cramp from the confined space. Time dilates. Minutes stretch like hours. You feel every inch of iron pressing against your skin, every spike a reminder of impending death. Outside, footsteps echo. The door swings open and shut again, but you're still trapped. The Iron Maiden symbolizes the fusion of ingenuity and cruelty, a device designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. And as you lay inside, caught between life and death, you wonder, how did people survive such an ordeal? How did they endure the slow, inevitable approach of pain? Some never did. Others bore the scars for life, living reminders of human capacity for both endurance and cruelty. As the torchlight fades, your mind drifts. You imagine yourself outside the chamber, free, breathing fresh air. But reality presses in. You're still inside. Still a prisoner. The air outside the Iron Maiden's cold chamber feels like a distant memory as you're hauled into a new setting, one soaked in shadows and whispered dread. You stumble forward, eyes adjusting to flickering candlelight and the faint metallic scent of blood mingled with old incense. Welcome to the Chamber of Mirrors, a psychological torture not often spoken about but devastating nonetheless. Here, the mind becomes the battlefield, and your own reflection your relentless tormentor. You're seated in a small room lined floor to ceiling with polished, distorted mirrors that twist and warp your image. At first, it's disorienting, your face stretched into grotesque shapes, limbs elongated or shrunken. But soon, the funhouse effect turns sinister. Mainstream historical fact: during the Renaissance and later centuries, mirrored rooms were sometimes used in prisons and madhouses to confuse and disorient prisoners, playing tricks on their sense of reality and heightening paranoia. The psychological stress could lead to mental breakdowns, often indistinguishable from physical torture's effects. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some stories suggest that certain royal courts used mirror chambers not only to punish prisoners but also to test witches, believing distorted reflections could reveal hidden truths or curses. Whether this was genuine practice or superstition remains unclear. Historians still argue about the extent to which sensory deprivation and manipulation were officially sanctioned forms of torture versus folk methods or urban legends. But the impact on the human psyche is undeniable. As you sit in the chamber, the mirrors seem to close in. Your reflections multiply endlessly, each one a slightly altered, mocking version of you. The room's silence is punctuated only by your ragged breathing and the faint echo of your heartbeat. You begin to see not just one image but countless versions of yourself, each more twisted and anguished. They leer back at you, accusing, mocking, haunting. Your mind spirals, unable to find a fixed point in this kaleidoscope of madness. The isolation is profound. No sound from outside penetrates here. Only the cold gleam of glass and the slow crawl of terror. You try to focus on a single reflection, but it shimmers and distorts, fracturing your sense of self. Minutes, or hours, pass. Time loses meaning. Suddenly, the mirrors flicker with shadows, shapes that don't belong to you, phantoms, or memories. You can't tell. Your reflection smiles when you don't. It cries when you try to laugh. You shiver. The room feels alive, a living entity feeding on your fear. You realize that in some ways, this is worse than physical pain. There are no bruises to bandage here. No bones to set. Just the slow erosion of your mind. You clutch your head, trying to silence the cacophony of reflections. But it's no use. Your own face becomes the weapon. And the chamber of mirrors closes around you like a trapdoor, deep in the labyrinth of human cruelty. Your mind still reels from the chamber of reflections as you're dragged into a new hell, a pit where earth, fire, and brutality collide. The acrid smell of smoke burns your nostrils as you're forced down onto a rough stone slab. The walls are blackened with soot, and the flicker of flames casts monstrous shadows that leap and dance. You've entered the realm of burning tortures, a grim chapter in the long history of human cruelty where fire is both weapon and executioner. They bind you fast, arms stretched wide and legs secured, your chest exposed like a sacrificial altar. The air around you thickens with heat, the temperature climbing steadily, suffocating, relentless. Mainstream historical fact: burning at the stake was a common method of execution in Europe, particularly during the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. Victims were often tied to wooden stakes and set aflame, a method designed to punish and terrorize, reinforcing social and religious conformity. A quirky tidbit: in some places, victims were offered a last-minute reprieve if they confessed or named others, turning torture into a twisted game of survival and betrayal. There are records of people confessing to wild and absurd crimes simply to save themselves from the flames. Historians still argue whether the spectacle of burning was meant more as a deterrent or a religious purification. Some suggest it served to display the absolute power of the church and state, a fiery warning to dissenters. The flames lick your skin, small at first, like the touch of a cruel child, then fiercer, more consuming. You grit your teeth, muscles taut, as your senses become a riot of heat, smoke, and pain. The crackle of burning wood fills your ears, a harsh symphony accompanying your ordeal. But fire is unpredictable. Sometimes it kills swiftly, sometimes it licks slowly, savoring every second. You don't know which fate you face. As the flames grow, your skin blisters, the searing sensation overwhelming every other feeling. You try to scream, but your voice is lost in the roar of the fire. And then, a moment of surreal clarity. The world narrows to heat and light and a singular, desperate will to survive. The crowd's faces blur, their jeers and gasps washing over you like distant waves. You close your eyes and imagine something else: a cool breeze, a gentle rain, the soft hum of a fan. Because sometimes, even in the darkest moments, the mind finds refuge. You are both prisoner and witness to a terrifying dance, a dance where humanity's capacity for cruelty meets its fragile hope. And as the flames rise higher, you hold on to that hope. Because sometimes, survival isn't just about the body. It's about the fire inside that refuses to be snuffed out. The fire's heat fades from your skin, replaced by a creeping cold as you're dragged away from the pyre. Your body feels broken, but your mind, though battered, flickers with a stubborn spark. You're led to the final chamber, a place where silence is a sentence and stillness is the only hope. Here lies the infamous black hole prison, a pit of darkness and despair that swallows prisoners whole, literally and figuratively. You're lowered into a deep, narrow shaft, the walls slick with moisture and the chill of stone pressing in from all sides. The air is thin, stale, and suffocatingly close. The light above is a distant dot, slowly shrinking as the rope is released. The sound of footsteps fades until only your ragged breathing remains. Mainstream historical fact: black hole or oubliette prisons, hidden, cramped cells accessible only from above, were used in medieval castles and dungeons across Europe to isolate and starve prisoners. Some captives were left to die forgotten, a cruel erasure from the world above. Here's a quirky tidbit: the word oubliette comes from the French oublier, meaning to forget. Prisoners were literally forgotten in these vertical tombs. Some stories claim that guards would toss in rats or snakes to hasten the end, though historians debate the frequency of such cruelty. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of long-term isolation in oubliettes versus more active tortures. Some suggest that the slow mental decay from sensory deprivation was as effective a punishment as physical mutilation. You sit in the darkness, senses stripped to a bare minimum. No sight, no sound but your own breath. Time loses meaning. Hours stretch into days, days into an endless nightmare. You try to recall the faces of friends, the feel of sunlight on your skin, the softness of a breeze. But memory falters, slipping away like water through fingers. Your body aches from cold and immobility. Your mind battles loneliness and the creeping shadows of despair. In the deep silence, your thoughts become your captors. You relive every moment: the rat dungeon, the pair of anguish, the Iron Maiden spikes, the endless water torture, and you wonder if this darkness is worse than any pain. But even here, in the black hole, a faint pulse of resistance beats inside you. Because torture, as brutal as it is, often fails to erase the human spirit. And as you sit in the dark, waiting, you realize survival isn't about the absence of suffering. It's about the stubborn flame that refuses to be extinguished, even in the deepest night. Now, the journey nears its end. The worst is behind you, or perhaps, simply transformed into memory. You breathe deeply, savoring the fragile thread of hope that keeps you tethered. You made it through. Word count: 1084. Now, as the echoes of these tortures fade, take a moment to let your breath slow and your muscles unclench. The horrors you've witnessed were real, yet far behind us now, ghosts of humanity's darkest chapters. Let the images soften, the shadows retreat. Imagine a gentle breeze caressing your skin, a quiet forest under moonlight, or the soft murmur of rain on a windowpane. Each moment of peace is a victory over the darkness we explored. Remember, the cruelty we traced was never the end. It was a challenge to endure, to survive, and to find light where none seemed possible. So as you drift toward rest, hold on to that flicker inside. It's your shield, your strength, your quiet rebellion against despair. Sleep well, knowing the worst is past, and that dawn always comes.